So now that I have this basic teleport mechanic working and I can test it, and I have this basic points mechanic working and we've tested it, what I want to do is I want to start to I want to merge those two together. And what I want to do is I want to test my value of points. And if I reach 0, if my points equal 0 or less than 0, I want to fire off this this teleporter, this respawn mechanic. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to go to the player manager, which is in here somewhere. There we go. There's my player manager. And remember, the player manager is just doing one thing at this point. It has 2 actions assigned to it. It's taking our current float of points and converting that to a string and then printing it in a GUI label. So that gives us our heads up display. So what I'm going to do is typically I would add an additional state machine to the player manager and manage this through a different state machine. But for the sake of the demo and kind of keeping it streamlined, I want to present this concept and embed it directly into our player manager state machine. Later on in future presentations, I'll show a more appropriate way to integrate this, or kind of a more advanced way of thinking about this. But this will work just fine. So I have this this HUD printing, and again, its job is just to print the value of points. What I want to do is I want to test the value of points, and when it's 0, I want to fire off an event based on that. Now remember, I have variables. I got a couple different variables that I'm using. I have this player points to string. That's a local variable on my heads up display, and that's the thing where we store the string of points and allows us to print it to screen. Inside global variables, I have this variable called points, and the reason it's in global is because there's a couple of different state machines that deal with that data. So we have the good pickups and the bad pickups, and those are adding to or subtracting from the points, and then we're storing that, or we're printing that information through the player manager. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the one state that I have in my player manager, and I'm going to go to the logic category. And inside the logic category, we can do a float compare. And I'll just double click to add that action. What a float compare does is it allows you to compare 2 different float values. And based on those float values, we can fire off an action if they're equal, if they're less than or greater than, so we can have a couple of different things happening. The floats that I want to compare is I'm going to take my float number 1, and rather than feeding in a manual value here, I'm going to click on this little button here which toggles between variables. I'm going to click on this drop down menu and choose my global points variable. So what I'm saying here is that float 1, I'm comparing the value of float 1, and currently it's at 10. I want to compare it to float 2. So if points is greater than 0, float value 2 is 0. If it's greater than, for now, I'm not going to do anything because I just don't want to do anything. If it's less than 0, I want to fire off an event, and I want to fire off the same event if it's equal to. In other words, if we're considering our points variable as our health, if we somehow take some damage that takes us down to 0, so if we're equal to 0, or if we take some damage that results in us being less than 0, we want to fire off this respawn event. So I don't have any events attached to this this state machine at this point, so I need to create some. So I'm going to go to events, and I'll simply just call this, I'll call it respawn, or maybe I'll say go to respawn. So now I have this event titled go to respawn. I'll go back to my state. If it's equal to 0, I want to fire off the respawn. And then, there could be some scenarios where we take damage, where maybe we have, 1 or 2 points of health left and we take 10 points of damage. We could end up less than 0. So we want to make sure that both the equal and less than, in this case, are firing off the same action. Of course, we could separate it too and have them do different actions, but in this case, one action is going to be just fine. So from our heads up display, from our HUD state, I'm going to add the go to respawn. I'm going to right click and add a state and fire that off. So now I can test this without even firing off the respawn yet, because I don't have those actions. But I will name this state. I'll call this respawn. So based on that float compare, if I run around, then I'll just pick up an extra cube, I now have 20 points in the top left-hand corner. When I hit 0, we should see that second state fire. Now, it didn't fire, so I hit 0, now I'm at -10, -20, and so on. So obviously I missed something, so I'm going to go back and follow through on the logic here. And what I forgot to do, I have all my actions set up right and I have all the information set up right. I'm not testing this every frame. In other words, this only gets tested one time, and that's when we activate the state, unless we check every frame. So the first time we run this state, our current points value is 10, which is greater than 0, and it only gets tested one time. So if we check compare floats every frame, I'll check the every frame option, I'll hit play. We should be able to, once I get 0 points, I can see down in my player manager that the respawn action fired. So what I need to do next is I need to either recreate that teleport mechanic here on respawn, or I'll just go to my teleport and I'll take a look at this. So remember, my teleport works this way, that I have an idle state and it's waiting for a trigger event to be fired. If I go to respawn, what I'm doing is I'm getting a position that's storing that information in a vector3 variable, and then it's setting the position of all these dependencies here. So what I'm going to try to do, now I'm going to go check out my variables. I have one variable on the state machine, and it is spawn position. I'm going to go back to state. I have two actions. It's get position and set position. I could rebuild all of that directly into my player manager state machine, but I'm going to try to right click and copy states. I'm going to go back to my player manager, and I'm just going to right click and paste states. Now I have this respawn. This is the thing that I just copied, respawn 2. And the only thing that I'm really worried about at this point is I want to make sure that the variable came with it. And so I'll click on variables. Now you can see that I have an extra variable. I have a spawn position, which is exactly what we want. I'm going to go back to the state, and I'm going to wire this over to my new respawn. This is the thing that I copied from. And I'll hit play and I'll test it. So in other words, instead of just firing off a blank state, now you can see that that works perfectly. So my points are 0. Now I have a little bit of a bug here in that if I respawn the first time, I don't reset that back to, I haven't reset the player points, and I have not reset the test that compares our health points. So we can iron out those issues in just a short bit. But for now, I can just continue to retest this. So I toggled my play button. I'm going to go find my spawn location, and I'm going to pull this off to the side just to change the location. I'll hit the play button, and now when my health equals 0, and I'll just pick up a green cube, now I have 20. I'm down to 10, and now when I go down to 0, I fire off that respawn. And I could make this I could enhance this by maybe fading the camera out and slowly fading it in and doing some other visual effects up on screen to give a better idea that we just respawn. We could also reinforce this idea with sounds. But for now, we have that basic mechanic working. The only glitch is that I'm going to go back into my player manager. Currently, we get stuck in this respawn state. And so typically what we'll do is I'm going to delete this original respawn state that we never used. I'm just going to delete that. I'm going to rename this state simply respawn. And I'm going to fix this little bug that we have that gets us caught in the respawn state. We have a couple of different options. We're getting the position, and then we're setting the position, and we're doing all these things, and there's no exit event or finished event. And that's a good indication that we need to create a custom finished event. So in other words, none of these actions here support firing off an event. They're just doing what they're designed to do. They get a position, store it in a variable, then they move the thing that we want to our specified spawn position. So what we can do if we want to transition out of this state, we can right click, add a transition, and we can use this custom finished event. That simply means once all these actions are done, once they're complete doing whatever they need to do, then flow out to this finished state, and we'll just wire this back to the place where we're testing. Now, what we've done is we've just created a loop. So we've actually just kind of broken this thing, because if we are in the heads up state, that means that we have positive points. The minute that this float compare detects that our health or our points went down to 0, it's going to respawn us, send us back to the original state, but our health is still stuck at 0. So we need to correct for that for a minute. In fact, when I hit the play button, I'll probably get an error inside Playmaker that once I hit 0, I'm probably going to crash this thing because it just creates a loop. And yeah, you can see that we get this error, this warning down here in the bottom left-hand corner. We get this loop count exceeded error, and we see that our state machine, we get this kind of cautionary white yellow line, and we have an error. So it paused Unity for us. So I need to correct that, and there's a couple of easy ways that we can correct this. The most appropriate way is I'm going to create a new state. This state is going to be the state that I want to be the start state. So in other words, we want to start on state 1. Instead of calling this state 1, I'm going to call it init, short for initialization, and this will be the first state that we come to kind of set the parameters for our project. Now, in the init state, what I want to do is I want to set the variable of points to something other than 0. But before I do that, let me set this as the start state. You can see that our start state is pointing to the HUD graphic, or the HUD state right now, and what I'm going to do is on init, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to choose set to start state. Okay, so now we start in init. We don't have this state flowing into the heads up yet, but once we get to the respawn, I do want to pass it back to init. And all this is going to do, this initialization state, is set our points value back to the default of whatever we want to start our game with. So in other words, right now in our variables tab, if we go to global variables, the first time we play this game, our points variable starts with the value of 10. But once we start playing the game and we subtract from that, we're at whatever the value of that variable is. And in the case of this machine, it's looking for 0. So on the initialization state, what we'll do is we want to do a set float. And I'm just going to type in set in the search field. Or maybe I'll even say set float because I want to filter a little bit more clearly. And you can see that under the math category, there's a set float value. So I'm going to double click. The float variable that I want to set is global points. And the float value that I want to set it to is that initial, whatever we want our points to start off with. Now, if we're thinking of this in terms of health, maybe I want to set the initial value to 100. I don't want to do that every frame. I just want to do it one time. I don't have any event action in here, so we're going to be stuck in the initialization state. So in other words, if I hit the play button, we've just set our float value to 100. I can see it over here, but there's no way to transition out of this state. And unless we add another action that allows us to do that, what we need to do is go to the state, right click, and choose that finished transition. It's a system transition, and then I'll just wire that down to the heads up display. So the logic here is that we initialize the value of points, we set it to 100 or whatever we want this value to be, then we pass it to the heads up display, and the heads up display is doing the exact same thing it had been doing before. It's converting our float value to a string, it's printing that on screen, and then it's constantly looking at that value to see if it reaches 0. So I actually don't have enough here to subtract to test this because of course I need 10 cubes, at least at the rate that I have them plugged in. So the damage that these cubes are doing, if you remember, it's subtracting 10. So I could bump up this value and to debug this and make sure that it's working just fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my player manager, and on this initialization value, I'm going to take that down to something more reasonable. And again, this is just temporary. I'll set it to 20. So now the result is it's basically going to ignore whatever that initial variable value is, because when we hit play, you'll see our points in the top left-hand corner now read 20 because it passes through that initialization state. So if I pick up a cube, it works. Once I hit 0 points, it respawns and then sets my point value back to the default. So we've cleared up that loop, and it sends us exactly where we want it to go based on our spawn point. So that's the basic nuts and bolts of kind of a system that will cause us to respawn. So of course I can't continue to test this because I ran out of the bad stuff. While we're in this presentation, there's one additional change that I want to make, and it's a really simple one. I'm looking at all the state labels for all of the objects inside the game window. That's why my green cubes all say idle. That's why my blue platform, my teleport platform says idle, and that's why my moving platform currently says state 1 and state 2. I'm looking at the playmaker states at runtime. At this point, I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to toggle my Unity player off for a moment. I'm going to go down into Playmaker. I'm going to click on the Preferences tab. And all the way at the top, you'll see that the second option down says Show State Labels in Game View. I'm going to uncheck that. So now when I hit the play button, you'll see when I look out into my game, there's no more state labels, which is exactly what I want. So I don't have all that kind of visual noise up on screen. So I'll collect 2 more bad cubes just to fire off that respawn one more time, and it's working like a charm. So in future presentations, I'll show you some additional ways to think about this and how to integrate it back into your game. But for now, that's the basic mechanic we're going for. So at this point, we could make more of these good cubes and bad cubes and kind of just distribute them around our map. And we'll start thinking about how to tie this in with our narrative. And now is a really good point, a really good time to go back and start to rethink your initial map design based on what we know. How can we influence our map design to accommodate this idea of we have good stuff and we have bad stuff, and we're kind of avoiding the bad stuff and trying to get the good stuff. I'll push forward in a few more presentations and look at some other collectible concepts and some other danger concepts. But at this point, we should be able to continue to go back to our concept map and start to layer in some concepts based on what we know. But we'll catch up more in the next presentation.